When the war veteran found a shivering puppy behind a dumpster, he thought he was just saving a dog. But months later, he discovered that the puppy wasn't a dog, and that changed everything. It was one of those gray mornings, the kind where the wind feels like it cuts through your skin, and the silence of the city seems to scream between the lines. And it was exactly in that kind of silence that Daniel, a man marked by battles that went far beyond the war zone, walked with hunched shoulders and a tired soul, trying once again to survive just another ordinary day, when his eyes were drawn to something hidden between garbage bags and soaked cardboard boxes. A cardboard box, old and partially falling apart from the rain, moved slightly behind the dumpster outside the building where he lived, as if it held inside it one last breath of life. Something small, defenseless, and forgotten. Curious, but with the instinct always on alert that had never left him since he came back home. He walked closer with steady, quiet steps, like he was still in hostile territory. And when he lifted the flap of that box, what he saw made him freeze for a second that felt like forever. There was a puppy curled up inside, its body shaking uncontrollably, bones showing under a tangled, dirty coat, and two huge, deeply sad eyes staring up at him with a mix of fear, pain, and an almost invisible trace of hope. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a silent plea from someone who had already lost almost everything. Daniel, who had seen men die in his arms, who had heard screams in the middle of the night even years after leaving the battlefield, felt something different in that moment. Something that tightened his chest, that broke through the walls he'd built, just to stop feeling anything at all. And there, in the cold, the filth, and the abandonment, he crouched down, pulled the puppy close to his chest, and whispered with a shaky voice, "You're okay now, little one. You're not alone anymore." In that moment, he thought he was just doing the right thing, offering warmth, shelter, and a bit of dignity to an animal abandoned by someone cruel. But he didn't know, he couldn't have imagined that this encounter would be the starting point of a story that would go far beyond everything he thought he understood about companionship, instinct, and survival. Because in just a few months, that puppy would grow in a way he had never seen before. And when he looked into that creature's eyes again, he didn't see a dog anymore. He saw something wild, and what happened next changed Daniel's life forever. Daniel Moretti lived in a small two-room apartment in the outskirts of the city, a quiet, somewhat forgotten place where the peeling walls and old furniture seemed to echo the same loneliness he carried inside himself. Ever since he came back from the war, years ago, his life had turned into a kind of automatic and hollow routine. Waking up too early, wandering aimlessly through still dark streets, drinking black coffee with no sugar while staring out the window, avoiding eye contact with the neighbors, and hoping, every night, that sleep would come before the nightmares did. He rarely talked to anyone. Words, once sharpened for commands and combat strategies, now felt too heavy for everyday use. Small talk drained him. Laughter annoyed him. Parties or crowds put him on edge. Like any random corner could suddenly explode into a memory, a pain, or a flashback he'd rather keep buried. And even when surrounded by people, Daniel felt invisible, like the world had moved on without him. The therapists who tried to help him said he needed to find something that would reconnect him to life. A new routine, a purpose, a symbol of a fresh start. But he didn't believe in symbols anymore, or in fresh starts. Not until that day. Until the day when, by instinct, impulse, or maybe fate, he reached out his arms and picked up that forgotten puppy behind a dumpster. That night, for the first time in many years, he didn't eat dinner alone. With the puppy wrapped in an old towel and sleeping in the corner of the couch, Daniel watched that tiny body breathing with difficulty and felt something unfamiliar begin to grow in his chest, a kind of responsibility that went beyond simple care. It was as if, in some quiet, unspoken way, the two of them had chosen each other. The little dog, or what he believed to be a dog, didn't talk, didn't ask questions, didn't judge, didn't demand explanations. He just existed, and in that simple existence, he filled a space inside Daniel that he hadn't even realized was still empty. Little by little, the veteran began to build a new routine, not for himself, but for that small creature who now depended on him. He bought dog food, washed blankets, learned how to warm milk to the right temperature, went on short walks around the block, just so the animal could explore the world, and slowly realized that, almost without noticing, He was rediscovering that world too. What he didn't know yet, though, was that this unlikely new beginning would come with an even greater mystery, because that animal, now sleeping in the corner of the room, wasn't what it seemed to be. That cold morning, Daniel didn't have a specific destination. He walked like he always did, stepping out of the house, but not really going anywhere, just letting his feet carry him across cracked sidewalks and empty alleyways, as if the motion alone was enough to quiet the unrest inside his chest. The sky was overcast. A thin layer of fog clung to the ground, and the smell of damp garbage mixed with diesel from passing garbage trucks gave that part of the city an even more forgotten feel. That's when something subtle caught his attention. A barely audible sound, a muffled whimper, high-pitched, but so soft it could have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Daniel stopped out of instinct, his eyes instantly scanning the area the way he used to during patrols. His gaze locked onto a small cardboard box, poorly covered by a torn piece of plastic, sitting between two dumpsters against the wall of an old, abandoned corner store. He walked over slowly, feeling a knot in his stomach that he couldn't quite explain. With each step, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't a bark, it wasn't a meow. It was something more raw, more primal, a choked whimper, like the kind that comes from a creature that's cried so much. All that's left is a whisper of pain. When Daniel crouched down and lifted the flap of the box, what he saw froze him for a few seconds. Curled up in the bottom of the cardboard, shaking like life itself was about to slip out of its body, was a skinny puppy, its fur soaked and filthy, its wide eyes full of panic, ribs pressed sharply against its thin skin, and a bit of discharge dripped from its nose. The animal could barely move, but even then, when it noticed Daniel's presence, it tried to hide its head between its paws, like it had already learned to expect the worst from anyone who got too close. Daniel felt his heart tighten, in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, he thought about walking away, not because he didn't want to help, but because he knew exactly what that look stirred in him, and he was afraid he wasn't ready to open up another wound. Taking care of that puppy, as simple as it might seem, was more than just offering shelter. It meant getting involved, getting attached, caring again. And for someone who had spent so long trying to shut himself off from everything, that was terrifying. But then the animal let out another faint whimper, something like a human sigh, and it was as if something inside him snapped. Like that pain didn't just belong to the creature, it belonged to him too. Without thinking twice, Daniel took off his jacket, gently wrapped the trembling little body, and held it close to his chest, feeling its warmth return, even if just a little. The puppy didn't resist. On the contrary, it seemed relieved, as if, even that young and hurt, it somehow knew that here, it had finally found safety. Daniel looked around, as if searching for whoever was responsible, or maybe just someone to share the weight of that moment with. But there was no one, not even a shadow, just silence, wind, and abandonment. And so, without a plan, without knowing what would come next, he went back home, with a fragile creature in his arms, a heavy heart full of uncertainty, and the feeling that this was more than just a rescue. The first night was quiet, but heavy with tension. Daniel settled the puppy into an improvised basket, lined with old blankets, placed right next to the couch where he usually spent his sleepless nights, listening to the pipes creak or the windows rattle in the wind. For the first time in a long while, he didn't just sit in silence staring at the emptiness. His eyes were fixed on that tiny, curled-up body, sleeping deeply, as if relieved to have finally found shelter. The puppy still wasn't eating well, and its gaze was cautious, always watching, hesitant, as if trying to make sure it wouldn't be betrayed again. But little by little, as the days passed and Daniel's steady care continued, something began to change. On the third night, the animal crawled out of the basket and, timidly, pressed its body against Daniel's legs. While he watched the news with the volume low, Daniel stayed completely still for a moment, unsure whether he should move the puppy away or let it stay. But when he felt that soft warmth and the steady rhythm of its breathing on his leg, something inside him gave in. By the following week, the puppy was already sleeping right next to his mattress. There was no leash, no command, no obligation, just trust. A quiet kind of trust, built step by step, like teaching a broken heart how to love again. Daniel started going out more often to buy dog food, learned which treats the animal would accept without turning its nose away, and began adapting the apartment so it could explore without fear. Old rugs became little playpaths, and even the scratched-up walls stopped bothering him. They were, after all, proof that something was alive in there, proof that he himself was slowly coming back to life. And the most surprising thing was that Daniel started to smile again. At first, it was just the corner of his mouth lifting as he watched the puppy stumbling over its own paws. Then came the quiet chuckles when the little one would bite at his shoelaces with stubborn determination, like it was fighting a personal war against his shoes. Later, he started talking to it, not like it was an animal, but like he was talking to an old friend who had always been there. A silent friend, but a present one. The dog, or what Daniel still believed to be a dog, became his only companion. Someone who didn't need to understand his scars to respect them, who didn't ask about the past, or expect plans for the future. He just stayed, loyal, steady, real, and for the first time in many years, Daniel felt like he wasn't alone. But what he didn't know yet was that the deep, almost spiritual bond growing between them would soon be put to the test in a way neither of them could have ever predicted. Because no matter how strong the connection was, a truth was drawing near, a truth that was about to change everything. As the weeks went by, Daniel started to notice small changes. Subtle details in the puppy's behavior that, at first glance, seemed like quirks of personality, but over time, became signs that were impossible to ignore. The growth, for example, was way faster than normal. In less than 2 months, the animal, once small enough to fit in a towel, was already taking up half the couch. Its paws had grown wide, its muscles firm, its fur thicker and darker, and its snout, once short and rounded, had started to lengthen slightly, revealing features Daniel couldn't match with any dog breed he had ever seen. But what struck him the most, and stirred a kind of unease that was hard to explain, was the sound. He never barked, not even once. When he wanted attention, he would growl softly, or let out a deep, low, guttural sound. And at night, especially on the colder ones, he would howl, a long, melancholic sound, filled with an ancient kind of pain that seemed to cut through walls and reach something ancestral deep inside the soul. It wasn't just any howl. There was something primitive about it, something wild, something that made Daniel sit up in bed in the middle of the night with his heart racing and his eyes wide open, as if that sound triggered memories of battles he had never fought, but somehow still remembered. The animal's behavior around other dogs also started to stand out. When they passed through parks or streets where other dogs were around, he didn't pull at the leash with excitement, didn't wag his tail, didn't show any signs of typical canine friendliness. On the contrary, he would stop, observe in silence, keep his distance. The other dogs, once they noticed him, would change completely. Some barked frantically, as if trying to drive him away. Others simply lowered their heads and backed off. It was as if they knew. Daniel tried to ignore it. He kept telling himself he was just dealing with a street animal, traumatized, with quirks that were hard to explain. But the more time passed, the more the doubt grew inside him, like an uncomfortable seed that refused to stop sprouting. He couldn't look at the animal the same way anymore. As much as he loved him, as much as that bond had become essential to his emotional survival, something inside Daniel began to whisper, softly but constantly, that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just an unusual dog. There was a mystery there, a secret behind those amber eyes, and that haunting nighttime howl. And even if he didn't want to admit it, Daniel knew, deep down, way deep down, that he was about to discover something that would change the way he saw his loyal companion forever. When the animal passed 40 kilos and started showing a presence far too imposing for a regular dog, Daniel realized he could no longer keep ignoring the signs. The rapid growth, the heavy silence, the way the creature's eyes seemed to see beyond the obvious, all of it painted an unsettling picture that could no longer be explained away with easy excuses. He needed answers, even if he was afraid of what he might find out. The next morning, without thinking too much, he put on his coat, clipped the leash onto the animal, which now already had the size and presence of a young wolf, and headed to the nearest veterinary clinic, carrying in his chest a weight he couldn't name, and in his hands, the kind of nervousness that comes when you know you're about to face a truth you've been running from. The moment they stepped into the clinic, everything felt off. Even though the animal was calm, he drew attention immediately. The looks were cautious, suspicious. A smaller dog, across the waiting room, started to whimper quietly, as if sensing some ancient danger coming from that amber-eyed creature. Daniel, always sharp to notice even the smallest details in his surroundings, caught it all. And it only made the discomfort inside him grow stronger. During the exam, the veterinarian's demeanor began to shift, little by little. It started with puzzled expressions, then curiosity, then a certain restrained nervousness. She carefully examined every part of the animal's body. The oversized paws, the long, sharp teeth, the elongated snout, the firm and well-defined muscles. There was nothing about him that resembled any of the common breeds Daniel knew. Every inch of that body told a different story. And then came the realization. The answer he didn't want to hear, but somehow already knew. That creature he had cared for, fed, protected, and loved like a war companion wasn't a dog. It was a wolf, a real wolf, wild, instinctive, uncontainable. The revelation hit like a weight dropped on everything Daniel had built up to that point. Within seconds, his mind was flooded with memories. Every howl in the middle of the night, every deep and strange stare, the way the animal watched the world around him, not like a curious dog, but like a calm, silent, and alert predator. How had he not seen it before? Or maybe he had seen it, but chose not to. On the way back home, Daniel didn't say a word. The animal walked beside him, calm, confident, as if nothing had changed. And maybe, for him, nothing really had. But for Daniel, everything was different now, because he finally understood what he had taken in that day behind the dumpster. And as frightening as that was, as much as the world might say it was dangerous or unthinkable, a part of him knew, with absolute certainty, that what he felt wasn't regret. It was fear, yes, but also, it was love. The veterinarian's revelation was just the beginning. In no time, the news spread among neighbors, clinic staff, and even strangers on social media. And like any story that spins out of control, it quickly stopped being just about a veteran who took in a puppy and became viewed as a potential public safety issue. The buzz caught the attention of local authorities, and before Daniel could even prepare himself, he received the first official notice at his door, a summons demanding an explanation for keeping a wild animal within the city limits. It didn't take long for inspectors to show up in person. Men with cold voices, technical eyes, full of procedures and little room for empathy. They said they understood his attachment, that they saw the bond between man and animal. But that didn't change the facts. The law was clear. Keeping a wolf in a residential area was prohibited. And, as if they were reading an unshakable sentence, they gave him a short, almost cruel deadline to give up the animal voluntarily before it would be taken by force. Daniel listened to everything in silence. On the outside, he looked calm, but inside, everything was falling apart. It felt like he was being ripped away from yet another battle he wasn't ready to walk away from. In the days that followed, he tried everything, reached out to shelters, talked to biologists, sent emails to animal welfare organizations, tried to convince anyone willing to listen that the wolf, despite his wild nature, posed no threat, that he had been raised under Daniel's care, that he slept beside him, that he had never shown aggression toward anyone, and that the bond between them couldn't be broken by a simple legal clause. But no one truly listened. The responses were cold, automatic, rehearsed. Some people showed sympathy, sure, but they all said the same thing. He would have to give up the animal. And that's when Daniel made the hardest and most noble decision of his life. He didn't run. He didn't go up against the law, but he didn't accept losing him either. Instead, he sold everything. He put his apartment on the market for less than it was worth, gave up his car, gathered every penny he had saved over the years, and left. No party, no goodbyes, no explanations. Just a backpack on his shoulders, a heavy soul, and the wolf walking beside him, just like always. He bought a remote piece of land, far beyond the edge of the city, where the only sounds were the wind cutting through the trees and the distant songs of birds. A simple place, but wide, open, free, like the heart of someone willing to start over one more time, even after everything. There, with his own hands, Daniel began to build a shelter. Every fence post he drove into the ground, every board he nailed, every piece of wire he fastened, was more than just physical structure. It was a symbol of the commitment he had made, not to the law, not to society, but to the being he had saved, and who, deep down, had also saved him. He built a safe, reinforced enclosure where the wolf could run, howl, rest, and live without fear. It wasn't a cage, it was a refuge, a space where instinct and affection could coexist, where nature didn't have to be controlled, just understood. He no longer had much of anything, no valuable property, no urban comforts, no financial stability, but he had something that couldn't be bought. He had the loyal companionship of that animal, and with it, a purpose that gave meaning to everything he had lost. Daniel gave up his former life, his stability, his home, just to make sure his best friend wouldn't be treated like a threat. And not for a single second did he regret it, because on that piece of land, between trees and silence, he found what so many men spend their entire lives searching for: a place to love and be loved in return. Daniel never planned on telling his story. He was never the kind of man who looked for attention, applause, or understanding. All he wanted was to live out his days in peace, next to the one being who had managed to break through the walls of silence and pain he'd built around himself over the years. But, as so often happens with stories that are just too real to stay hidden, life found a way to share what he had tried to keep quiet. It all started with a simple post from an old army buddy, who, after a quick visit to the remote land where Daniel had restarted his life, was deeply moved by what he saw. He took a few discreet photos: the wolf running free under the open sky, the rustic shelter surrounded by trees, and Daniel sitting on the wooden porch with the animal lying at his feet. The two of them in a silence that said more than 1,000 words. The post went viral. Within just a few days, thousands of people had shared the story: veterans, animal lovers, nature advocates, strangers from all over, all touched by the unlikely friendship between a man scarred by war and a wild creature abandoned as a pup. Donations began pouring in unexpectedly and overwhelmingly. Small amounts, large amounts, food, building materials, letters of support, words of gratitude. There was something about that story that transcended borders and ideologies, a pure reminder that compassion still existed, that real bonds could still form between such different worlds. And then, in the face of the public outpouring, the unthinkable happened. The government, pressured by thousands of messages and the emotional force the story had stirred, decided to re-evaluate the case. A new inspection was scheduled. The same veterinarian who, months before, had warned Daniel about the risks of keeping a wolf in an urban environment, would now be the one responsible for inspecting the new home and deciding whether the conditions were truly safe and appropriate. When he arrived at the property, the professional didn't just find well-built fences or proper food. He found a bond, a connection so real and silent that no cold legislation could deny it. He saw a wolf that didn't growl, didn't run, didn't attack, but walked calmly beside Daniel, like he knew exactly where he belonged. And in that moment, he didn't need technical language or reports. He just had to observe. The man who was once trained to fight now lived to protect, and the animal born to live in the wild had found safety in the eyes of a human. And faced with that, the veterinarian simply nodded, visibly moved, like someone who understands that some connections go beyond logic, and that the law isn't always the one who should decide where love is allowed to live. Little by little, what had started as a quiet escape, a final, desperate effort to protect a friend, turned into something bigger, something Daniel had never imagined for himself, but that suddenly made all the sense in the world. That piece of remote land, surrounded by trees and silence, which had once been just an improvised refuge for two wounded souls, began to come alive in a new way. With the help of ongoing donations, supplies offered by people who believed in the cause, and most of all, with his own calloused hands and quiet persistence, Daniel expanded the space. He built new enclosures, opened safe trails, installed basic water systems and shelters, and soon other animals began to arrive. Not many at first. First came a female wolf, rescued from an illegal captivity, her eyes still marked by fear. Then, an orphaned fawn, followed by two foxes found injured along the side of a highway. Each new creature that entered that land carried with it a story of abandonment, loss, or violence. Stories that, somehow, Daniel understood without needing to hear a single word. And it was there, among the fences built with effort and the trees swaying in the wind, that he found something he had lost many years ago. A reason to wake up every day. A purpose that went beyond survival. One that filled the emptiness left by battles, goodbyes, and scars no one else could see. The sanctuary became known by few, but revered by all who did. It wasn't a zoo, and it wasn't a tourist spot. It was a sanctuary, a place where wounded, rejected, or rescued wild animals could begin again, just as he had. And the wolf, the one who had been found shivering with cold behind a dumpster, too small to be frightening, but big enough to change everything, was never alone again. Now, he ran among his own, but even among others of his kind, it was beside Daniel that he rested at the end of the day, his head laid gently over the feet of the man who had taken him in, without knowing who or what he really was, and who, even after finding out, never stopped loving him. In the end, after the cold nights, the crushing doubts, the quiet sacrifices, and the small daily victories, Daniel understood that the moment behind the dumpster wasn't the start of a simple adoption. It wasn't a gesture of charity, nor an act of compassion. It was a reunion. Two broken beings, abandoned to their own fates, recognized their pain in each other and chose to walk side by side, even without knowing where the path would lead. He believed, with all his heart, that he was saving a dog, but the truth was much deeper and far more beautiful than that. It was the wolf who saved him, because it was through that silent, wild presence that Daniel relearned how to breathe without fear. It was in that golden gaze, steady and honest, that he found the trust the war had taken from him. And it was by building a world where that wolf could exist freely that he finally understood he deserved freedom too. Not the kind found on battlefields, but the kind found in feelings, in affection, in surrender without fear. Today, surrounded by tall trees and the constant sound of wind brushing through the leaves, the two live in perfect harmony. The wolf runs free, howls when he wants to, lies at Daniel's feet like an extension of his soul. They don't need words or explanations. The silence between them says it all, a silence filled with understanding, loyalty, and mutual gratitude. And even if the world never fully understands the greatness of that bond, it doesn't matter, because Daniel, who for so long lived trapped by the ghosts of his past, found in the instinct of a rejected animal everything he once thought he had lost forever: love, purpose, and peace. And that was all he ever needed.